There is a kind of morning that does not ask permission. It arrives the same way it always has, the same pale light pushing through the same curtains, the same coffee maker gurgling on the same counter, the same sound of a pickup truck warming up in the driveway. Everything the same, except the reason for it, except the destination, except the man climbing into the driver's seat with no particular place to go and no one expecting him there. Earl Denton sat in his 2001 Ford F-250 at 5:47 in the morning, engine running, heat kicking on slow, and he did not pull out of the driveway. He sat there with both hands resting on the steering wheel, the way a man holds something he is not sure belongs to him anymore. The radio was off. The heater filled the cab with that particular smell of old dust and warm rubber. Outside, Muskingum County, Ohio was still dark, still flat, still quiet in the way that only places like this can be quiet, which is to say completely and without apology. He had driven this route for 22 years. Out of the driveway, left on Drummond Road, past the grain elevator, past the Sunoco station where Mike Bellard would raise a hand from behind the register without looking up, down Route 60 another 4 miles to the gate of Ashland Steel and Fabrication where his badge would beep and the turnstile would click, and the smell of hot metal and flux would greet him before he even got through the door. 22 years, more than half his life. The body remembers a thing like that long after the mind has been told to stop. So he sat in the driveway and he let the muscle memory run its course. 5:47. He was always the third car in the lot. He used to be able to set a watch by it. He sat for 38 minutes. Then he cut the engine and went back inside. Vera was already up, standing at the kitchen sink with a mug of coffee, watching the yard the way women watch things when they are working through something they are not ready to say out loud. She heard him come in. She did not turn around. "You sat in the driveway again," she said. "Engine needed warming." She nodded slowly. She knew. He knew she knew. That was the particular mercy of 29 years of marriage. You did not have to perform your pain for each other. You could simply exist in it together, separately in the same kitchen, in the same morning, each holding your own version of the same quiet weight. He poured himself a cup and stood at the opposite window. Outside the backyard, the old hay barn leaned slightly south the way it always had, the way it would keep leaning until one winter finally made up its mind about it. Beyond that, 3 acres of dead grass that had not been used for anything productive since Earl's father died 11 years ago. And in the corner of the yard, almost out of sight from the kitchen window, a pile of something dark and uneven that had appeared 2 weeks earlier without any particular ceremony or explanation. Cobb Hargrove had called on a Tuesday. Cobb was the kind of man who always led with your name, as if he was doing you a favor by remembering it. His voice had the texture of a man who had never stopped practicing being liked, smooth at the surface and working hard underneath. "Earl, Cobb here. Listen, I've got a situation over at the tannery. End of season, we've got leather scrap we need moved. The county dump's not taking hide waste this month, some EPA thing, you know how it is. I figured you've got that back acreage doing nothing. Would you mind if I had the boys drop a load? Just temporary, be out of your hair by spring." Earl had said yes without thinking about it. That was the problem with Cobb Hargrove. He asked questions that sounded like favors and were not quite either. They had grown up on the same 2-lane road, graduated the same year from the same high school, played on the same football fields on Friday nights in October. That shared history gave Cobb a kind of credit that he had been drawing against for 40 years without ever quite replenishing. The account always seemed full, because neither of them looked at the balance too closely. So 2 weeks ago, a truck had backed up to the corner of the property and left what Earl estimated to be 300 pounds of leather scraps, offcuts, irregular pieces, edge trimmings from the Hargrove tannery operation over in Caldwell. Some of it was dried out. Some of it still had a smell. All of it was supposed to be temporary. Earl looked at that pile every morning from the kitchen window, and it looked back at him the way certain problems do when you have not yet decided to make them your business. He turned 54 in March. He had been out of work for 4 months. The severance from Ashland Steel was nearly gone. There had been no dramatic ending to his 22 years at the plant. No ceremony, no speech, no moment that felt proportionate to what was being taken away. There had been a meeting in a conference room on the 3rd floor with 2 people from Human Resources and his direct supervisor, a younger man named Greg who had the particular discomfort of someone delivering bad news he had not personally made and did not personally believe in. The company was restructuring. The Muskingum facility was being consolidated with a plant in Tennessee. Some of the work was going overseas. Greg had used the word transitioning 3 times in 7 minutes. Earl had listened to all of it and then signed the paperwork and shaken the hands that were extended to him and driven home and sat at the kitchen table for 2 hours without taking his jacket off. Vera's teacher salary covered the mortgage and the utilities and the grocery runs, but it did not cover the space in a man's chest that purpose used to occupy. No amount of money covers that particular absence. Nothing does except the work itself, the specific daily fact of going somewhere and doing something and coming home having been useful. And for the first time in his adult life, Earl Denton had none of that. He had applied at 3 other fabrication plants within driving distance. 2 had not called back. 1 had called back to tell him they were looking for candidates with certifications in digital welding systems, which was the industry's polite way of saying they were looking for someone 30 years younger who would work for 30% less, and would not bring with him 22 years of expectations about what the job was supposed to feel like. He had gone to the workforce retraining program at the Zanesville Community Center, where a woman named Deborah with a laminated badge had explained that he qualified for a 10-week course in HVAC installation. He had sat in that folding chair in that fluorescent-lit room and nodded and thanked Deborah, and filled out the preliminary forms and driven home and not gone back. He was not a man who complained. His father had raised him in the specific tradition of Ohio men who understood that certain things were simply the weather. You did not argue with rain. You put on a coat. But 4 months into a silence this large, Earl was beginning to understand that there is a difference between enduring something and being slowly erased by it. He was being erased, not dramatically, not all at once, just the way a name wears off a piece of equipment over years of handling. You do not notice it happening while it is happening. You only notice when it is already done and the name is gone and you are looking at a surface you can no longer read. He could feel it in the mornings most clearly. In that 38-minute stretch in the driveway with the engine running and nowhere to go, the body still obeying an itinerary that no longer existed. He spent that morning doing what he had been doing most mornings since the layoff. He replaced a section of fence on the south side of the property, where the posts had been leaning for 2 seasons, and would eventually go over if no one addressed them. He cleaned the gutters on the hay barn. He reorganized the garage shelves for the 2nd time in that same month, which was the kind of thing a man does when he needs to move his hands, but has run out of real reasons for the moving. The reorganization did not take long because there was nothing new to organize. He stood in the garage afterward looking at the clean shelves and the properly hung tools and the swept concrete floor, and felt the hollow particular satisfaction of having completed a task that did not need doing. He ate lunch alone at the kitchen table while Vera was at school. A sandwich made without tasting, bread and turkey and mustard applied, because it was always applied. He sat with the sandwich and the local paper and read an article about the county fair prize results from September and a piece about road work on Route 60. Then he set the paper aside and looked out the back window at the pile in the corner and finished the sandwich. There was a thing his father used to say when Earl was a boy, something Ray Denton said in the distracted way of a man already thinking about the next task. Look at what other people throw away. That is where you find out what they do not understand yet. Earl had never thought much about it as a child. It had seemed like the vague, practical wisdom of a generation shaped by shortage, a Depression-era sensibility passed down through the decades. But standing at that kitchen window on a cold November afternoon with nothing on his schedule and the rest of the day bearing down on him with its empty weight, he heard those words differently for the first time. He walked out to the pile. He crouched beside it and picked up a piece of leather the way you pick up something you are considering seriously for the first time. It was thick, good weight to it. The surface had the fine, tight grain of quality hide, not the corrected or buffed surface of lesser processed material, but the actual texture of the animal, the small variations and marks and slight imperfections that told you something had lived in this skin before the tannery received it. He had been around fabrication and industrial materials long enough to know the difference between what was made to look good and what actually was good. This was the latter. This was full-grain leather rejected not because of quality deficiency, but because of dimensional inconvenience. The pieces were too small for the tannery's industrial cutting dies, which were calibrated to produce large, consistent panels for belts and upholstery, and strapping on an assembly line basis. These scraps were the negative space of the operation, the gaps between the die cuts, discarded not because they lacked value, but because the machine could not use them. He spent 40 minutes crouched beside that pile in the November wind, going through it piece by piece with the methodical attention of a man accustomed to sorting materials by their properties and understanding what each property told him about potential use. There was enough here to work with, not for anything large-scale, but for something that required care over quantity. He carried an armful into the garage and set it on the workbench. He looked at it for a while under the fluorescent light. Then he went inside and upstairs to the room at the end of the hall that had always been called the storage room, but that had really been, for the past 11 years, his father's room. The room where Ray Denton's things had gone when there was nowhere else for them, and no one with the heart to let them go. Ray Denton had died at 71 of a heart that had simply decided it was finished. He had been a quiet man in the particular way of men who carry a great deal inside them and have no vocabulary for any of it. He had farmed this property for 40 years, and before that he had done something else, something Earl had always known only in outline, the way children know things about their parents that the parents never thought fully to explain. What Earl knew was that his father, before he was a farmer, had worked leather. Saddles and tack and custom strapping, work done for ranchers in Kentucky and West Virginia, the kind of handmade gear built to specifications a machine could not replicate, built to outlast the decade in conditions that would destroy anything lesser. Ray had done it for about 8 years in his 20s, and then he had come back to Ohio to farm his own land, and he had put the other thing down and almost never spoken of it again. Almost. Earl remembered once, when he was around 12 years old, watching his father at the kitchen table with a narrow strip of leather and a curved needle, repairing a bridle for a neighbor whose horse had pulled the hardware loose. He had watched his father work with a focused quiet that was different from his usual quiet, a quality of attention that came from somewhere deep and settled, the concentration of a man doing something he knew completely, without effort, without doubt. Earl had watched for a while and then asked what he was doing, and his father had looked up briefly and said, "Fixing something that wants to be fixed," and gone back to the work. Earl had not thought about that memory in 20 years. It surfaced now the way old memories surface when you have finally gotten still enough to hear them coming up. The storage room smelled of cardboard and old wood and something underneath both of those things, something dry and specific, and without a precise name, that Earl had always associated with his father without ever analyzing it. He pulled the chain on the overhead bulb and stood in the orange light and looked at the shelves. Boxes in Vera's handwriting. A wooden trunk. Paper bags folded carefully at the tops. A pair of work boots that had not been worn in more than a decade. He found the metal case behind a stack of old Farm Bureau magazines, the issues going back to 1988. Olive green, the kind of tool case from a time when tools came in cases built to last as long as the tools themselves, with a simple latch that gave a solid, satisfying click when he pressed the button. He lifted the lid. Inside, nested in a fitted wooden tray lined with old green felt, was a set of leatherworking tools unlike anything Earl had seen outside of a specialized catalog. A swivel knife with a handle worn smooth and dark from decades of use. Stitching awls in several gauges. Leather punches in graduated sizes, 8 of them, arranged by diameter. Edge bevelers. A creaser with a rosewood handle. A stitching groover. A bone folder. A leather skiving knife. A set of edge finishing stamps. All of it maintained, cleaned, oiled, the metal still carrying its temper, the handles worn to the specific shape of the hand that had used them most. Someone had put these away understanding that they were not finished, that they were resting. Underneath the tool tray there was a composition notebook, black and white marbled cover, the kind used in classrooms in the middle of the last century. He picked it up. On the cover, in his father's careful block lettering, Denton, Leatherwork, Notes. He stood in that room for a long time without opening it. The light from the single overhead bulb threw long shadows across the shelves. Outside the small window, the last of the November afternoon was giving way to the gray that comes before dark in Ohio in that season, a color that is not dramatic and not beautiful, but is completely honest. He stood there and held the notebook and felt something he could not have named precisely, a sense that this object had been waiting, that it had been here through 11 years of him not knowing to look for it, and that the particular conditions of this particular autumn were exactly what had been required to bring him to this room at this moment. He took the case and the notebook downstairs. He sat at the kitchen table under the overhead light and opened the notebook to the first page. What he found there stopped him in the way that very few things stop a grown man. Not shock, something slower and larger. The feeling that arrives when a shape is revealed that was there all along, underneath everything, hidden not because anyone hid it, but because you had not yet stood in the right place to see it. His father's handwriting filled 42 pages. Technical notes in Ray Denton's compressed and careful hand. The letters formed with the precision of someone who did not write often and understood when he did that he was writing for keeps. Descriptions of tanning processes and their effects on leather behavior under stress and heat and moisture. Diagrams of stitching patterns with measurements in fractions of inches. Notes on leather grades and their specific characteristics under different load conditions. Formulas for conditioning treatments with dates written in the margins and observations added over what appeared to be several seasons. The language was practical and exact throughout, the language of a man who had learned by doing, and was recording what the doing had taught him before it could be forgotten. In the middle section the notes narrowed to a single project. His father had designed a belt, not a dress belt, not a fashion item, a work belt. Specifically, a heavy-duty welding and fabrication belt, designed to be worn in high-heat industrial environments where ordinary leather either stiffened into uselessness or degraded from combined exposure to heat and flux and oils. Ray Denton had worked a summer at a steel fabrication plant in Steubenville in 1967, filling in between farming seasons, and he had noticed what every working man in that environment eventually notices, which is that the gear available had been designed by people who had never done the jobs the gear was supposed to serve. too stiff to be comfortable across a full shift, too thin at the load-bearing points, hardware that conducted heat against the body, buckle plates that pressed into the lower back wrong during extended forward bending over a workpiece. He had spent the following winter designing something better. The design in the notebook was meticulous in the way that only genuine problem-solving is meticulous. A double-thickness strap in specific dimensions, wider at the back than at the front, following the natural load distribution curve of the lumbar under forward lean. A double-lock stitching pattern using wax thread in a specific weight, identified through testing. Solid brass hardware chosen for heat resistance relative to skin contact and non-conductivity. A contoured cut at the back section that Earl could see immediately would reduce pressure on the lumbar, during the kind of sustained bending that welders and fabricators do dozens of times per shift. Notes on how to skive the leather at the edges so the buckle plate seated flat over time, and did not create the pressure ridge that cheaper belts developed after a few months of use. Notes on break in time and specific treatments to accelerate softening without weakening the fiber structure. At the bottom of the materials cost estimate page, there was a note added in handwriting slightly different from the rest, written later, added as a thought that arrived separately from the technical work. I never got around to this. Life came in and I put it down, but someone should make this. It is a good idea, it would hold up. Earl read that sentence 4 times. Then he closed the notebook gently and held it in both hands and sat at the kitchen table in the overhead light for a long time. The garage was cold when he went out after dinner. He had not told Vera what he found. He was not ready to put words around it yet, because the right words had not arrived, and he did not want to use the wrong ones on something this particular. He spread the leather scraps across the workbench and set the open notebook beside them at the design page and looked at both for a while. He was a welder, not a leather worker. 22 years of working with metal, learning its behavior under heat and load and stress, understanding where it held and where it failed, and what the difference between those outcomes looked like in the material itself before it became visible to anyone else. He did not know leather the way his father had known it, but the principles his father had written were the same principles that governed his own work in a different medium. Load distribution across a seam, stress concentration at connection points, the relationship between a joint and the force applied across it over time, the behavior of a material under sustained use versus momentary peak stress. Earl understood these things in his hands and in his eye. The medium was different. The logic was the same. He picked up the swivel knife and tested its balance. Heavier than expected and balanced in a way that told you this was made for sustained use, for hours of cutting, not for occasional tasks. He set it down. He picked up a scrap of leather and held it next to the design diagram. Then he made his first cut. He worked until past midnight. He ruined 4 pieces learning the swivel knife, each failure teaching him something different about what the blade wanted from his hand. He punched holes that were off position until the 15th hole landed where it was supposed to be, and he understood what adjustment had made the difference. He tried the stitching awl and understood within 10 minutes why his father had written specifically about thread tension and pull angle, understood it not intellectually but physically, in the resistance he felt and did not feel in the thread as it passed through the channel. At 12:30, he had something that was not yet a belt but had begun to commit to the intention of being one. He locked the garage and went inside. Vera was asleep. He stood in the bedroom doorway and looked at her in the dark, her shape under the quilt, the particular way she slept on her side with one hand tucked under her face, a posture he had known for so long it had become part of what home meant to him at the cellular level. 29 years. She had been a 3rd-grade teacher when he met her, and she was a 3rd-grade teacher now, and in between she had raised Jessie and kept this house together. and paid the bills these past 4 months without saying anything about it beyond what was practical. She loved him in the specific way of a woman who had decided that her love was a fact and not a negotiation and not a performance. He was grateful for that love in a way that he almost never said out loud because Earl Denton was Earl Denton, and that was not the architecture of who he was. He did not wake her. He got in quietly and lay in the dark, and for the first time in 4 months he did not spend the last minutes before sleep going over the inventory of what he had not managed to do. He was thinking about the double lock stitch and why the thread tension mattered to the load distribution along the seam. He was thinking about what his father had written. I never got around to this. Life came in and I put it down. He was back in the garage at 6 in the morning. He worked every day for 3 weeks, not with urgency, not with the frantic energy of a man trying to prove something to a world that had dismissed him, with patience, which is a different thing and considerably rarer in a man who has been humiliated, because humiliation tends to produce either paralysis or aggression, and patience is the third option that most men cannot locate when they need it. He learned the swivel knife until the cuts came clean and consistent. He learned the stitching groover and understood why the channel depth was critical to whether the thread would wear correctly over years of use. He learned to skive leather at the edges by feel, the pressure of the blade against his palm becoming a language that told him when the angle was right. He made mistakes and understood them, and did not repeat those specific mistakes again. This was the only real way to learn something that lived in the hands. No shortcuts existed, and he did not look for any. There is a particular loneliness in being useful your whole life, and then suddenly not being needed. It is not the loneliness of isolation, which has a clear shape and a clear cause. It is the loneliness of irrelevance, which has no shape at all, which moves through a man like water through sand and leaves nothing you can point to and say, "That is the thing that hurt me." You simply find yourself standing in a garage on a November afternoon wondering when exactly you became someone the world had stopped requiring. Earl Denton had never thought of himself in large terms. He had never wanted anything that could be called a legacy or a vision or a dream in the way people used those words in the motivational content Vera sometimes had playing on Saturday mornings. He had wanted to do his work well and come home and be present in the specific ways. A man of his type was capable of being present, which was not expressive and not elaborate, but was consistent and reliable and real in the way that only consistency over decades can be real. He had wanted to provide. He had wanted to be someone his son could take the measure of and find the measurement sound. The leather work was exercising something he had feared losing. He could feel the difference in himself after 10 days at the bench. He was sleeping better. He was eating with more interest. He was less inside his own head in the way that unemployment had pushed him inward, that relentless internal audit of everything he had not done or not said or not become. The bench pulled him outward into the material world, into the specific reality of leather and thread and brass, and the way these things behaved under his hands. And the material world was, as it had always been, a better place for Earl Denton to live than the inside of his own reckoning. He thought about his father while he worked, not the way he had thought about Ray Denton in the years since he died, mostly in the abstract, a presence more felt than remembered. He thought about him specifically now. The way the man moved through a room, the economy of it, nothing wasted, no gesture without purpose. The way he could look at a piece of equipment and know within 30 seconds what was wrong with it and what it needed, not because he was exceptional, but because he had paid attention long enough that paying attention had become structural to who he was. Earl had inherited that quality or thought he had. It was the thing he was most certain of about himself and the thing he most feared losing, because the quality of attention is not preserved by will alone. It has to be exercised. It has to have something real to fasten onto, or it weakens like an unused muscle. He saw himself hold up a finished belt under the barn light one evening and look at it the way his father used to look at a repaired bridle. The same settled focus, the same quality of attention. He understood in that moment that he had been watching his father do exactly this thing since he was 12 years old and had been carrying the image without knowing he carried it. Cobb Hargrove called again that second week, the timing casual in the way that careful timing always looks casual. "Earl, just checking in on you. How's Vera holding up? Listen, that offer on the back acreage is still on the table. The market's moving and I'd hate for you to miss the window. Good money for land that's just sitting, something to consider." Earl listened to all of it and said he would think about it and hung up. He went back to the garage. There was something in the specific quality of Cobb's patience about that land. A successful man's patience is always proportional to his certainty about the outcome. Cobb was too patient. He already knew something about the value of what he was asking for, something he had not shared with Earl, and that gap was the thing that Earl filed in the back of his mind and did not yet know what to do with. Jesse called that Thursday evening. Jesse was 26, living in Columbus, working in logistics data for a software company that Earl understood in the way you understand things that operate entirely outside your own experience, which is to say superficially, and with a persistent sense that there is more there than you can see. Jesse was smart in the way Earl had always been privately in awe of. The fast lateral thinking that made connections Earl could follow but could not have originated himself. He had Vera's quickness and Earl's stubbornness, and the two things in combination made him simultaneously impressive and occasionally difficult to reach. "How are you doing, Dad?" "Fine." "You find anything yet?" "Working on something." The pause that meant he was deciding whether to push. Working on what? Earl looked at the belt form on the workbench, 3 days from finished. The leather properly dyed and conditioned. The back contour cut correctly. The stitching running straight, and even now, the tension consistent, the thread seated in the groove. "A project," Earl said. Jesse was quiet for a moment. The low ambient sound of Columbus was faint through the phone, that urban frequency with no particular landmark in it. "Okay," Jesse said. "Let me know if you need anything." "I will. I mean it. I know you do." They said goodnight. Earl went back to the garage. He finished the first belt on a Saturday afternoon near the end of November, 3 weeks after he opened the notebook in the storage room. He set it on the workbench and stood back and looked at it with the specific honesty that you apply to something you made when you are trying to see it as it actually is rather than as you hope it is. The stitching on the left of the buckle plate had a deviation of about 2 millimeters that he could see and that no one else would see unless they were looking for it. The leather was properly conditioned and finished. The edges were burnished clean and smooth with the bone folder. The brass hardware was seated correctly and set with the right tension. The back contour followed his father's design with the modifications his hands had suggested, the skiving more gradual than the notebook described, which he believed would serve the long-term durability better. He picked it up and ran it through his hands, flexed it, pressed his thumbs into the stitching at the buckle. No give. The hardware did not shift. The leather moved as a unified piece rather than as assembled components pulling against each other. It had the quality of something made rather than manufactured, a distinction that sounds like preference but is actually structural. You feel it in your hands before you see it. He carried it inside and set it on the kitchen counter. Vera looked up from her grading and looked at the belt and then looked at him. "You made this?" "Yes." She set down her pen and picked it up and turned it over in her hands. She pressed her thumb hard into the stitching. She flexed it once, the same test. She looked at the hardware and ran her fingernail along the edge finish. Ray's tools. His design. I built what he had written down. She set it back on the counter with the deliberateness of someone who understands when an object deserves careful handling. Earl, she said quietly, this is really something. He picked it up and went to the bedroom and put it on. He stood in front of the mirror on the closet door. A man 54 years old, heavier than he used to be by 15 pounds that had arrived gradually over 2 decades of shift work and had made themselves at home. He was wearing work jeans and a flannel shirt and a belt that he had built from his father's 40-year-old design using leather that someone else had decided was too inconvenient to be worth keeping. He did not look like a man who had done something remarkable. He looked exactly like himself. But he felt something that had been absent from this body for 4 months. Something adjacent to dignity, which is the specific quality of feeling that arrives when a man's hands have made something real, something that will persist past the morning, something that was not there before he put it there. On Monday, Dale Marsh came by on his way to a job site. A general contractor Earl had stayed in loose contact with the way men in small counties stay in contact, which is to say they ran into each other occasionally and spoke plainly. Dale was wearing his work gear when he knocked, and he looked at the belt on Earl's waist the way a contractor looks at structural work, which is with his eyes doing the engineering before his hands confirm it. "Where'd you get that?" "Made it." Dale stepped back slightly. "You made that belt?" "Leather working. My father had the tools." Dale looked at it for another long moment. "That is full-grain leather." "Yes." "How much for one?" Earl had not considered the question. He had made the belt because he needed to make something, because his hands needed a reason that was real. He named the first price that arrived in his mind, a number that felt correct without any calculation behind it. Dale did not negotiate. He pulled out his wallet and paid and left, and Earl went back to the garage and started the second belt. He did not know what he had started. He did not know about the forum post that was coming, or what it would open up. He did not know what Cobb Hargrove's interest in that back acreage was really about, what was underneath the warm voice and the patient phone calls. He did not know what Vera had quietly done, in her specific way, 6 months before any of this, because she knew him well enough to know he would say no if she asked, and she had decided the thing was worth doing regardless. He did not know any of it yet. What he knew was the garage at 6 in the morning, with the light coming through the high window, and lying across the workbench in a long, pale rectangle. What he knew was the weight of his father's tools in his hands. What he knew was the smell of good leather and wax, and the particular satisfaction of a cut that went where it was supposed to go. 4 months earlier, a younger man named Greg had told Earl Denton in a conference room on the 3rd floor that he was being transitioned. He had signed the paper and driven home, and sat at the kitchen table in his jacket. He had spent 4 months being taken apart by forces that had nothing to do with who he was, by an industry that had looked at a man who knew how to make things, and decided it had no further use for what he knew. But here was something about a man who knows how to make things. The knowing does not leave. You cannot restructure it into a different country. You cannot consolidate it to a lower-cost facility. It lives in the hands. It lives in the eye that has learned to see what is true in a material versus what only appears true. It lives in the patience of a man who has done something difficult long enough to understand the difference between the difficulty that means stop and the difficulty that means keep going. Earl Denton stood in his garage in the late afternoon light of a November day in Ohio, with the second belt taking shape under his hands and his father's notebook open beside him on the bench. And he understood for the first time since March that he had not been erased. He had only been interrupted. The belt grew under his hands, and the afternoon moved around him, the way afternoons move around men who have found something worth the remaining light. The forum post went up on a Wednesday in January. Earl did not know about it for 3 days. He was in the garage when Vera came to the door with her laptop open, holding it the way she held things she was not sure how to explain, slightly away from her body, tilted toward him like an offering he might refuse. "You need to see this," she said. She set the laptop on the workbench beside the belt he was working on and stepped back. Earl wiped his hands on a shop rag and leaned over the screen. The post was on Welding Web, a forum he had heard of but never visited, the kind of online gathering place for tradesmen that had replaced the conversations men used to have in parking lots after shifts. The username was Darryl Pipeline WV, and the post was titled, "Found the last belt you will ever need." Under the title, a photograph. Earl recognized the belt immediately because he had made it, and because no two things you make with your hands look exactly alike, and you always know your own. Darryl from West Virginia had bought that belt off Craigslist 4 months ago. He had been using it on a pipeline job in the Eastern Panhandle, working in conditions that Earl understood from his own years at the plant, the kind of sustained high-heat environment that ate through ordinary leather belts in a season. He had been wearing it 6 days a week through autumn into winter, and it looked, in the photograph, the way good leather looks when it has been used hard and properly. It had darkened and conformed. The brass hardware had developed the specific patina of working metal. The stitching was intact along every inch of the seam. Darryl had written 2 paragraphs about it in the plain, specific language of a man who evaluates things by how they perform and does not reach for poetry when accuracy will do. He had written that the belt had not stiffened in cold mornings the way synthetics do. He had written that the contoured back section distributed weight differently from any other work belt he had used, that after a 10-hour shift, he was not carrying the same lower back fatigue he had accepted as normal for 20 years. He had written that he had put it through conditions that would have destroyed anything he had bought at a hardware chain inside of 3 months, and it had not failed at a single point. He had written that whoever made this thing knew what they were doing. At the bottom of the post, he had put the Craigslist contact that had been on the listing. That contact was Earl's email address. There were 214 replies. Earl scrolled through them slowly. Most of them were asking where to buy one. Some were asking the price. Several were from men who described their own experience with work belts in the way that men describe long-standing problems they have quietly accepted, with a kind of resigned familiarity that lights up when someone offers a solution. A handful were from men who seemed to know leather, and were asking specific questions about construction and materials that Earl could have answered in detail, because his father had answered them in the notebook first. He looked at the 214 replies for a while. Then he looked at Vera. She was watching him with the specific expression of a woman who already knows what the news means and is waiting for the man she loves to catch up. "How many emails?" he said. "I checked before I came out," she said. 47 since yesterday morning." Earl looked back at the laptop screen. Then he looked at the belt on his workbench. Then he looked at the pile of leather scraps visible through the small high window out in the corner of the yard under the January sky. He was quiet for a moment. "I can only make so many of these," he said, "by myself." "I know," Vera said. She picked up the laptop and went back inside. Earl stood at the workbench for a while. He picked up his swivel knife. He set it to the leather he had been cutting before she came out and made a clean, straight pass along the marked line. Then he set the knife down and stood with his hands flat on the bench and did the arithmetic that had just become necessary. He answered 47 emails that evening at the kitchen table, one at a time, with the particular care of a man who has never written a business email in his life and is not going to start cutting corners now. He described the belt. He described the materials. He described the process in plain terms. He gave a price and a lead time of 6 weeks. He did not have a website. He did not have a business name. He had his email address and his word. 31 of the 47 wrote back to order. He sat at the table with those 31 orders in front of him on the screen and understood that something had changed. Not in the world. The world was the same county and the same January and the same problem of a man without a plant to go to in the morning. But something in the structure of the next few months had shifted. The way the structure of a room shifts when someone opens a window, and air that did not exist a moment ago begins to move through it. He went to the garage and looked at his materials. He looked at what remained of the leather scraps from Cobb's truck. He looked at his tools. He looked at the space. He called Dale Marsh the next morning. Dale had a hay barn on his property that he was not using for hay anymore, a habit of the county, buying and keeping agricultural buildings whose original purpose had been superseded but whose usefulness had not yet been fully imagined. Earl drove over and looked at it. It was sound, insulated poorly but fixable. Electrical was in and working. There was a full concrete floor. There was enough space to work at a serious scale if you organized it with the attention that serious scale required. Dale said he could have it for a token rental because Dale was that kind of man, the kind whose generosity operated quietly and without announcement, and because he had seen what Earl made and understood its quality, the way a contractor understands the quality of materials, which is in his body before it reaches his mind. Earl spent 2 weeks setting up the barn. He built workbenches from dimensional lumber, solid and level, angled correctly for standing work. He ran additional lighting. He organized the tool layout the way his workstation at Ashland had been organized, which was for efficiency and flow, nothing wasted, everything at hand without searching. He transferred his father's tools and his own accumulated materials, and the notebook, which lived now on a shelf above the primary bench where he could reach it without looking. He called 2 men he knew from Ashland, Gary Prout and Dennis Kowalski, both laid off the same wave as Earl, both good with their hands in the general way of men who have spent careers in fabrication. He did not offer them a salary he could not guarantee. He told them what he had and what he thought it could become and what he needed from them and what he could pay right now, which was modest, and what he believed it could grow into, which was genuine. Gary said yes the same afternoon. Dennis called back the next morning. They learned the work. Earl taught what his father's notebook had taught him, and what his own hands had added to that in the weeks since. Gary had a natural feel for the stitching that surprised Earl, a steadiness of hand that produced consistent line work from almost the first week. Dennis was slower to the swivel knife, but had an instinct for hardware fitting that meant his buckle assemblies were cleaner than Earl's own from the start. This was the particular satisfaction of teaching something you know. You give it to someone else and it does not diminish. It multiplies. By March, they were producing 8 belts a week. The waiting list had grown to 64 names. It was in March that Jesse came home for a weekend. He arrived on a Friday evening with the particular energy of someone who has been working hard in a city and needs 2 days of quiet, and he walked into the barn on Saturday morning with a mug of coffee and stood in the doorway and looked at what his father had built. Earl did not look up from the workbench right away. He finished the pass he was on and then set down the knife and turned. Jesse was quiet for a moment. He was looking at the organized space, the running tools, the belts in various stages on the benches, the notebook on the shelf, the 2 other men working without hurry at their stations. "You're serious about this," Jesse said. "I am." Jesse came further into the barn and set his coffee down and picked up one of the finished belts from the drying rack. He turned it over in his hands the way Dale had, the way everyone did, the way you handled something when your hands were telling you something your assumptions had not prepared for. "Dad," he said, "this is really well made." "I know." Jesse set it down. He looked at the shelf with the notebook. "Is that Grandpa Ray's?" "Yes." Jesse was quiet for another moment. "He designed this." "He designed it, never built it." Earl turned back to the bench. 40 years it sat in a box. Jesse stood in the barn doorway for a while longer. Then he went back inside. Earl heard his son's footsteps cross the yard. He did not know what Jesse was thinking. He rarely did. The thing about building something from nothing is that it does not stay simple once it starts to work. Success has a specific weight to it, and that weight is not the weight of relief. It is the weight of new obligation, new complexity, new territory that the original plan did not map. Earl was managing the material supply and the production schedule and the order list and the email correspondence and the barn rental and the payroll for Gary and Dennis, none of which he had trained for, all of which he was doing by the logic that had served him at the plant, which was to look at the problem as a system and find where the system was inefficient and fix the inefficiency before it became a failure. The materials were the first constraint he hit. The leather scraps from Cobb's pile had lasted through February, but they were not going to last into spring at the pace they were working. Earl needed a source of full-grain leather that was consistent and reliable and priced at a level that his margins could absorb. He made calls. He visited a tannery supplier in Columbus. He drove to a leather goods distributor in Pittsburgh. He found what he needed at prices that worked if the production volume held, and the waiting list kept converting to orders, which it was doing at roughly 70%. It was during the Pittsburgh trip that he stopped at a Tractor Supply on Route 30 outside of Canonsburg, because he needed a box of screws for the barn, and because a man does not drive past a hardware supply without going in. It was a habit from decades of the kind of work where you never pass up the chance to be prepared. He was in the third aisle when he saw it. On a pegboard hook in the work accessories section, next to a row of nylon tool belts, there was a leather belt. He reached for it before he had time to think about why he was reaching. He held it up. He turned it over. He read the back of the card. The stitching pattern was not the same as his. It was close, not identical. The dimensions were different by perhaps a quarter inch at the back contour. The brass hardware was the same grade, but the hardware profile was slightly different. The leather was thinner by a meaningful amount, not full grain, top grain at best, the kind that was processed to look right rather than built to hold. It was a product that a man who did not know leather would look at and think of as comparable to Earl's belt. A man who knew leather would know in 30 seconds that it was not. The brand name on the card was Tri-State Work Gear. Earl had never heard of it. He turned the package over and looked at the barcode sticker on the back. Under the barcode, in small print, a manufacturer code he did not recognize. He took a photograph of the package on his phone. He bought his screws and drove home. He had Gary look up Tri-State Work Gear that evening on the laptop in the barn. It took Gary 11 minutes to find what there was to find. Tri-State Work Gear was a product line, not a company. It was distributed by a regional supply outfit operating out of Caldwell, Ohio. The registered address of the supply outfit was 4 Commerce Loop, Caldwell. Earl knew that address. He had driven past it 100 times. It was the address of Hargrove Tannery. He sat with that for a while. Gary and Dennis had both stopped what they were doing and were looking at him. He did not say anything for a moment. Then he said, "Okay, let's finish these 2 up tonight." They finished the 2 belts and Gary and Dennis went home. Earl locked the barn and stood in the yard in the cold March night and looked at the sky and thought about Cobb Hargrove. He thought about the pile of leather scraps in the corner of the yard. He thought about the way Cobb had delivered them, casual and helpful, neighbor doing a neighbor a favor. And he thought about what those scraps were, which was full-grain leather in irregular sizes, the exact material that Earl's father had identified as ideal for this application. He thought about the phone calls asking about the land and the patient warmth in Cobb's voice and the specific timing of all of it. The scraps arriving in November when Earl was at his lowest. The phone calls coming at regular intervals since then, not aggressive, just present, keeping the option alive. He thought about what Cobb had been doing with that leather before he put it in a truck and drove it to Earl's yard. He thought about what it meant that Cobb had then watched Earl build something and then launched a competing product line using the same grade of materials. He thought about whether there was something he had missed in the construction of this situation. He was an honest man, and honest men turn problems over and look at all the surfaces before they decide what they are looking at. He turned this one over for a long time. Then he went inside and sat at the kitchen table and pulled up his email and typed a message to the address on the Tri-State Work Gear distribution website asking for a sample and a wholesale price sheet and the name of the manufacturer, identifying himself as a retail buyer. He sent it and went to bed. He did not sleep immediately. He lay in the dark and thought about what he was going to find and how he was going to handle it when he found it, and what it said about Cobb Hargrove, that the answer was probably already clear to everyone who knew Cobb and had been clear for a long time, and Earl had simply not been looking. He thought about a thing his father had never said in words, but that the notebook made plain, which was that an idea is only as safe as the space you give it to develop before the world finds out about it. Ray Denton had put his idea in a notebook and put the notebook in a box, and that had been its own kind of protection. Earl had put his idea out into the world, which was the right thing to do, but the world included people like Cobb Hargrove, and that was something he had not fully accounted for. Vera moved beside him in her sleep, and he looked at the ceiling and did not say any of this out loud. 3 days later, the Tri-State Work Gear response came. It confirmed what he already knew. The sample images they attached showed a product that was a clear derivative of his design, modified just enough to make the claim of independent development technically possible, while being obviously untrue to anyone who held both objects in their hands simultaneously. The manufacturer listed was a production facility in Guangdong, China. The minimum order was 300 units. The per-unit cost was $11.40. $11.40 to undercut everything Earl was building at $47 a unit with American hands and American leather, and 40 years of his father's knowledge behind every stitch. He sat with the email open for a while. Then he printed it. He put it in a manila folder with the photograph he had taken at Tractor Supply and the screenshot of the Tri-State Work Gear registration information that Gary had found. He put the folder on the shelf in the barn next to his father's notebook. He did not call Cobb. Not yet. He understood instinctively, in the way of a man who has worked with load-bearing systems his whole life, that the right time to apply force is not when you first identify the failure point, but when you have confirmed the full extent of the weakness. You move when you know, not before. He went back to work. It was around this time that Vera mentioned casually one evening over dinner that she had done something 6 months ago that she needed to tell him about. Earl looked up from his plate. She told him in the direct way she had of delivering information that she had thought through completely. 2 months before the belt was finished, in October, she had been in the garage looking for a flashlight, and had found on the workbench the open notebook beside a half-cut strip of leather and two prototype sections Earl had stitched and abandoned. She had stood there long enough to understand what she was looking at. She had gone back inside without mentioning it. 3 days later, she had driven to Columbus with photographs of those first cut pieces and the notebook design page, and she had walked into the office of an intellectual property attorney named Sandra Birch. She had paid the retainer from her own savings account. She had filed for design copyright protection in Earl's name. The filing had been approved in November. Earl's design was on record with the Copyright Office as of November 12th of the previous year. Earl set down his fork. He looked at Vera. She was watching him with the expression she wore when she had done something she was certain about, and was waiting to find out whether he was going to be the kind of man she believed him to be. "You used your savings," he said. "Yes." "Without telling me." "You would have said no." He was quiet for a moment. The kitchen was still. Through the window the barn was lit, Gary still finishing something inside. "Why," he said, "before any of this even started, before you knew it would go anywhere." Vera looked at him the way she had looked at him for 29 years, with the complete knowledge of a woman who has paid close attention to the same man for a very long time. "Because I knew you," she said, "and I knew your father's notebook, and I knew what you were going to do with it even if you didn't know yet." Earl sat at the kitchen table, and his eyes did something they had not done since his father's funeral. He did not look away. He let it happen. Vera reached across the table and put her hand over his, and they sat like that for a while without speaking, and the kitchen was the whole world for a few minutes, which is the thing that 30 years of marriage can make available to you if you have both been paying attention. The next morning Earl took the folder from the barn shelf and added the copyright registration documents that Vera had kept in the filing cabinet in the spare bedroom. The folder was getting substantial. He put it back next to the notebook. He worked. Gary and Dennis worked. The waiting list held and the orders came in and the production pace improved as the three of them developed the shared rhythm that a small operation develops when the people in it are good at what they do and trust each other to be good at it. In May, Cobb Hargrove came to the barn. He arrived on a Tuesday morning in his pickup truck, dressed the way Cobb always dressed, clean and pressed in a way that communicated I am not the kind of man who gets his hands dirty anymore. And he stood in the barn doorway with his hands in his jacket pockets and looked around at what Earl had built with an expression that was carefully composed and gave nothing specific away. "Earl," he said, "this is impressive." Earl was at the bench. He did not stop working. Cobb. Gary and Dennis had both looked up briefly and gone back to their work, with the specific disinterest of men who understand when they are not supposed to hear something. Cobb came further in. He looked at the belts on the drying rack. He looked at the organization of the space. He looked at the shelf with the notebook and the folder, and did not look at them long enough to read anything but long enough to register that they were there. "I wanted to talk to you about something," Cobb said, "about the business." Earl set down his swivel knife and turned to face him. He waited. "I've got distribution contacts," Cobb said. "Regional, some national. I think what you're making here could move through channels you don't have access to right now. I could open those doors. We're talking a partnership arrangement. I bring the distribution network, you bring the product. We split the revenue on anything that moves through my channels." He said it smoothly, the way he said everything, with the warmth that was not quite warmth. He said it like a man offering a favor. Earl looked at him for a moment. "What percentage?" Cobb named a number. 40% of revenue to Earl, 60% to distribution. He framed it as standard for the industry. He framed it as the cost of access that Earl was not going to get any other way. Earl looked at him for a while longer. Then he said, "I need to think about it." Cobb nodded. "Of course, take your time." He looked around the barn one more time and his eyes rested briefly on the shelf again. "You've built something real here, Earl. Ray would have been proud." He said it, and Earl felt the specific displeasure of a good thing being used as a tool by someone who did not care about the good thing. He kept his face neutral. Cobb left. Earl watched the pickup truck go down the drive and turn onto Drummond Road. Then he picked up his swivel knife and went back to the leather. Dennis looked over from his bench. "You going to take that deal?" "No." Dennis went back to his work. "Didn't think so." That evening Earl sat at the kitchen table with his laptop and looked up the Tri-State Work Gear product line. In the month since he had first found it in the Tractor Supply, the line had expanded. 3 new SKUs. A second belt design that was further from his original than the first had been, which told him that Cobb or whoever was designing for him had understood the copyright risk and was trying to move the products away from the origin point while maintaining the market position that the origin point had created. But Vera's filing had a date, November 12th. Every product in that line that derived from Earl's design, whether directly or through deliberate modification intended to obscure derivation, was potentially in violation of a registration that predated Tri-State Work Gear by nearly 6 months. Earl was not a lawyer. He knew this. He knew that knowing you have been wronged and being able to do something about it were different problems requiring different tools. He wrote down Sandra Birch's number, the IP attorney Vera had used, and set it by the phone. He went to bed. Vera was reading. He lay down beside her and stared at the ceiling. "He came today," he said. "I know," she said. She did not ask how. Vera always knew. "He offered a partnership." She turned a page. "What did you say?" "Told him I needed to think." She turned another page. "And I'm not taking it." She nodded once, the smallest acknowledgement, and kept reading. That was all. That was enough. In 29 years they had built a language so compressed that whole conversations could happen in 2 gestures and a pause. This particular exchange had said everything that needed saying, which was that they both knew what Cobb Hargrove was, and they both knew what Earl was going to do, and they were both in agreement that doing it would take longer than they wanted and cost more than seemed fair and be worth it because the alternative was being the kind of people who let something like this stand unchallenged, and they were not those people. Earl looked at the ceiling and thought about his father. He thought about 40 years of a good idea sitting in a box. He thought about the patience of that, not the patience of a man who gave up, the patience of an idea that had not found its moment yet. He was not going to let what his father had left him be taken apart by a man who had been drawing on borrowed credit since high school and had finally overdrawn the account. He closed his eyes. In the morning, he called Sandra Birch. Sandra Birch had a small office above a dry cleaning business on 5th Street in Columbus, the kind of office that told you she was serious about the work and not about the appearance of the work, which was exactly what Earl needed. She was 51 years old, precise in her language, and had the specific quality of attention that Earl recognized from his own experience as the attention of someone who has learned to see what is structurally true about a thing versus what is presented as true. She did not waste his time with unnecessary warmth, and she did not make the situation sound simpler than it was. She looked at the folder, all of it, the copyright registration, the Tri-State Work Gear packaging photograph, the sample images from the email, Gary's research on the Caldwell registration, the timeline Earl had reconstructed from memory and receipts, and the dates on his email correspondence. She was quiet for a while after she finished. Then she asked 3 questions. Each one was more specific than the last, and each one told Earl that she had understood the structure of the situation immediately and was now checking the load-bearing points. "You have the copyright filing dated November 12th, she said. "Yes." "And their first product appeared in what you believe to be January of this year." "The first one I found was January. The registration was filed before that." Gary found the date. She nodded. She tapped the folder. "The challenge in design copyright is demonstrating access and substantial similarity. You have the access question answered by the geography and the relationship. Hargrove had physical possession of materials on your property. He had knowledge of your operation. You'll need to document the substantial similarity through expert comparison of the two products. I can arrange that." She looked at him. "Do you have a first-generation sample of your belt that you can verify was completed before November 12th? Earl thought about it. Dale Marsh had his. Dale had paid for it in October. Earl had the Craigslist sale record for Darrell's belt, which had gone out in September. He had Gary's order log going back to January, but the dates before that were in his personal email. "Yes," he said, "I can document it." "Then you have a case," she said. It was not delivered with enthusiasm. It was delivered as a finding, which was more useful. It's not fast and it's not without cost and the outcome is not guaranteed, but you have a legitimate claim and the filing gives you standing. Earl looked at her. What happens to him if it holds? Injunction on the infringing products. Damages calculated on their sales revenue during the infringement period. Potentially attorney fees if the court finds willful infringement, which the timeline suggests. She paused. The deliberate modification of the design to obscure the source actually works in your favor. It demonstrates awareness of the original, which undermines the independent creation defense. Earl sat with that. He was thinking about Cobb standing in his barn that morning with his hands in his jacket pockets, looking at the shelf with the notebook, looking around at everything Earl had built, saying Ray would have been proud. Using Ray. Using a dead man's name to smooth over what he had been doing in the months since he put 300 pounds of leather in Earl's yard. "Do it," Earl said. Sandra Birch nodded once. She turned to the next clean page in her legal pad. "Let's start with the timeline." They were in that office for 2 hours. When Earl walked out onto 5th Street in Columbus, the afternoon was bright and cold, and the city moved around him with the indifference of cities to the specific dramas of the men passing through them. He sat in his truck for a moment before starting the engine. He was not happy exactly. Happy was not the right word for what this felt like. What this felt like was the feeling of having correctly identified a load-bearing point and begun the process of reinforcing it. The outcome was still ahead of him. The work was still ahead of him, but the work was now organized. The problem had a structure and a plan and a person with the right expertise working inside it. He drove home. He told Vera that evening. She listened without interrupting, which was how she listened to things that mattered, and at the end she said, "Good," in the single-syllable way she had of conveying that a decision was sound without spending words she did not need to spend. "It'll take time," Earl said. "Most things do," she said. "That's not a problem. Time is what we have." He looked at her across the kitchen table. He thought, not for the first time, that he had married someone considerably more steady than he had understood when he was young enough to take that steadiness for granted. He had come to understand it properly somewhere in the middle of the 3rd decade, and the understanding had not diminished since. The next morning he went back to the barn. Gary and Dennis were already there, Gary running a stitching line with the confidence he had developed over the past 3 months, Dennis fitting hardware with the clean instinct that had made him valuable from almost the first week. The smell of the barn in the morning was leather and linseed oil, and the faint cold of the Ohio air that still pushed through the gaps in the insulation they had not fully addressed. Earl picked up his tools and went to work. He worked through April and into May, and the waiting list did not shrink. It stabilized at around 50 names and stayed there, which meant that the rate of new orders was matching the rate at which they cleared the list, which meant that the demand for what they were making was real and not a spike. This was the difference between a moment and a market. Earl understood the difference because he had spent his career in an industry that had confused them and paid for the confusion. He made changes to the operation. He brought in a fourth person, a woman named Bernadette who lived 3 miles down Drummond Road and had done upholstery work for 15 years before the shop that employed her closed. Bernadette's stitching was faster than Gary's and more consistent, and she had an eye for edge finishing that improved the finished quality of the belts in a way that was subtle and not subtle at the same time. The way quality improvements always are, invisible until you put the old thing next to the new thing, and suddenly you cannot unsee the difference. He adjusted the pricing twice, upward both times, not because he was greedy, but because the materials cost had clarified and the labor cost had clarified, and the pricing that felt right in the first weeks of not knowing what he was doing needed to reflect the reality of what he now understood about the actual cost of doing it properly. Both times he expected the waiting list to shorten. Both times it did not. He thought about what this said. He had been in a world his entire working life where the value of a thing was set by the market rather than by what the thing actually cost to produce correctly. The market at Ashland had set the value of his labor below what it cost to employ him and had resolved the discrepancy by moving the production elsewhere. He had experienced that as a personal failure for 4 months and was only now understanding it as a systemic one. The market for what he was making was behaving differently, which told him that the people buying it were capable of understanding value when value was presented honestly, and the thing itself was real. It told him something about his customers. They were men who worked with their hands and trusted what their hands told them. When your hands pick up something made properly, your hands know. There is no sales pitch involved. The thing speaks. He thought about this at the bench sometimes when the work was going well, and his mind had the particular freedom that comes with skilled repetitive work. The freedom to think without using the thinking part of the brain, if that distinction makes sense, which it does to anyone who has ever done real work long enough. He thought about his father. He thought about Ray Denton in the winter of 1967, sitting at a kitchen table in a farmhouse that no longer stood, working through the problem of a belt that did not exist yet in a form that could actually do what a working man needed it to do. Writing it down with that compressed, careful handwriting, thinking it through to the last detail, putting it in a composition notebook and then, over years, putting the notebook in a box. Life came in. The farm needed him. The family needed him. The belt stayed unbuilt in the notebook for 4 decades. Earl had always thought of his father as a farmer. That was the role Ray had occupied for as long as Earl had known him, and it was the role that defined him in the county's memory. But the notebook told a different story, or an additional story. Ray Denton had been a craftsman who became a farmer, not a farmer who happened to have some craftsman skills. The leatherwork had not been a hobby or a sideline. It had been a calling that he had set down when the demands of a different life required it, and that had waited, in the box, with the patience of something that understood it would eventually be found by the right person. Earl was the right person. He had not known he was the right person until he opened the box and read the notebook, and understood that his own hands were built for exactly the thing his father had designed and never made. There was a specific kind of grief in that, not the sharp grief of losing someone, the slow grief of understanding what a person was beyond what you knew of them while they were alive. Ray Denton had never talked about the leatherwork because that was how Ray Denton was built. which was the same way Earl Denton was built. And Earl had spent his whole life not asking his father the questions he now could not ask because the man had been dead for 11 years. He would have liked to show his father this barn. He would have liked to hand him a finished belt and watch his father's hands go through the same examination that every honest man's hands went through. The flex, the press at the stitching, the check at the hardware. He would have liked to see the expression on Ray Denton's face when the hands confirmed what the notebook had predicted, which was that it would hold up. He set that grief down the way you set down tools you are not using right now, not thrown away, just placed. It would be there when he needed to pick it up again. He picked up the swivel knife instead. In late May, Jesse came back for a weekend. He arrived on a Friday as he had in March, with the city energy that needed 2 days of quiet to settle. He went to the barn on Saturday morning without being asked. He stood in the doorway with his coffee and looked at the 4 workstations and the organized flow of the space and Bernadette's stitching running straight and sure and Gary fitting a buckle with the practiced ease of a man who had done it 800 times. He came to the bench where Earl was working and stood beside him and watched for a while without speaking. Earl was cutting a back contour, the long curved pass that he had been unable to do cleanly in the first weeks, and that he now made without thinking, the blade following the leather the way a good tool follows a material that it has learned. Jesse picked up a finished belt from the drying rack. He held it and turned it over and pressed the stitching. He flexed it. He looked at the hardware. He did all of this without being aware that he was doing it, in the unself-conscious way that people examine things when the thing itself compels the examination. He set it down. He looked at his father. "I want to help," he said, "with the business side, the online presence, the ordering system, the backend. You shouldn't be doing this on email." Earl kept cutting. He finished the pass and set the knife down. He looked at his son. "You've got your job in Columbus." "I know," Jesse said, "but this is better." Earl looked at him for a moment. Jesse was holding the finished belt in his hands again, not examining it this time, just holding it, the way you hold something that you have decided belongs in your life. "I'm not asking you to leave your job," Earl said. "I'm not asking your permission," Jesse said. It was the most purely Earl Denton thing that Earl Denton's son had ever said, and Earl recognized it immediately. Recognized it the way you recognize a quality you did not know you had passed on until you see it return to you from the person you passed it to. He almost smiled. He picked up the swivel knife. "We'll talk," he said. Jesse put the belt back on the rack. "Okay," he said. He picked up his coffee and went back to the house. Earl watched him cross the yard in the morning light. His son, 26 years old, carrying a coffee mug in the same way Earl carried a coffee mug, with the thumb through the handle and the other 4 fingers wrapped around the outside of the cup, a grip Earl had never noticed either of them using until this moment. He watched his son's back until Jesse went through the kitchen door. Then he turned back to the workbench. He set the leather for the next cut. He made the pass clean and straight and correct. There was a lot still ahead of him. The legal situation with Cobb Hargrove was moving at the speed of legal situations, which was to say it was moving, but not at a pace visible to the naked eye. Sandra Birch had filed the initial demand letter in May, and Cobb's attorneys had responded with the language of attorneys who believed they could outlast the opposing party's resources, which was probably the correct assessment of Cobb's strategic thinking. Earl had resources that were real but not large, and a legal process that could take a year or more, and outcomes that were probable but not certain. The business was growing, but growth created problems that stability did not, and Earl was learning those problems in real time the way he had learned the swivel knife, by making mistakes and understanding them, and not making those particular mistakes again. Jesse was circling back in. Earl did not know yet what form that would take or what it would require from either of them. And the waiting list was at 61 names, and the belts on the drying rack needed conditioning, and Bernadette was asking about a fifth station, and Gary had a question about a materials order. Earl Denton stood in his barn in the May light and understood that he was in the middle of something, not at the beginning of it and not near the end of it. In the middle, which is where the work lives, which is where a man finds out what he is actually made of, not in the beginning when everything is possible, and not at the end when the outcome is decided, but in the sustained middle when the difficulty is real, and the outcome is uncertain, and the only available response is to keep going. He kept going. Jesse stayed for 3 weeks that summer. He did not ask permission, and Earl did not offer resistance. The boy simply moved his laptop into the spare bedroom and showed up at the barn at 7 in the morning and started working. Not at a bench. At the small folding table in the corner that had previously held miscellaneous hardware and was now cleared and claimed, and set up with a monitor and a notebook, and the particular density of purpose that Earl recognized as his own quality returned to him in a younger body. Jesse built a website in 4 days. Earl had not known a website could be built in 4 days. Jesse explained that the 4 days were for making it right, not for making it fast, which was the kind of distinction Earl respected, and which told him something about his son that he had not fully understood before. The site had photographs that Jesse took himself with a camera Earl had not known Jesse owned, photographs of the belts and of the barn and of the hands doing the work, not glamorized, not staged, not made to look like something it was not. Real light on real leather in a real place. The hands in the photographs were Gary's and Bernadette's and Earl's own, identifiable by anyone who knew them but not named, not presented, simply present. Jesse named the business Denton Iron and Hide. He did not ask Earl first. He showed it to him on the screen after the fact, the way Vera had told Earl about the copyright filing, as a completed decision rather than a proposal. Earl looked at the name for a while. He looked at the logo Jesse had designed, which was simple to the point of severity, the letters in a plain serif font with a small stamp mark beside them, the kind of stamp that leatherworkers use for edge finishing, rendered as a brand mark. "Your grandfather's name," Earl said. "Our name," Jesse said. Earl looked at it for another moment. Then he said nothing and went back to the bench. Jesse took that for what it was, which was agreement, which it was. The website went live on a Thursday in June. By Saturday, the waiting list had added 31 names. Jesse adjusted the ordering system to add a delivery estimate at the point of purchase, which reduced the number of emails asking about lead time by roughly 70%, which gave Earl back 2 hours a week he had been spending on correspondence. Jesse restructured the pricing display to show the cost per year of use based on a projected 5-year lifespan against the cost of 2 cheaper belts that would fail in the same period. This was not a trick. It was arithmetic. But it was arithmetic that most people had not done for themselves, and doing it for them changed something in how they understood what they were looking at. In July, Earl raised the price again. The waiting list did not shorten. Jesse said, "The demand is inelastic," which was a phrase Earl did not know and did not need to know because what it described was something he already understood, which was that when something is truly what it claims to be, the people who need it will pay for it because they have tried the alternative and know the difference. In August, Sandra Birch called. Earl was at the bench when his phone rang. He wiped his hands and answered. Sandra was direct in the way she was always direct, delivering information in the order of its importance without preamble. Cobb Hargrove's attorneys had in May responded to the initial demand letter with a document that ran to 40 pages and argued 11 distinct grounds for dismissal. Sandra had expected this. She had responded in June with the expert comparison analysis she had arranged, a side-by-side technical examination of Earl's original belt, and the tri-state work year product conducted by a leatherworking expert from the Ohio State University Extension Program, a man named Dr. Anton Reyes, who had spent 30 years studying American craft traditions in material goods. His report ran to 22 pages and concluded with language that Sandra quoted to Earl from memory because she had read it enough times to know it. The report found substantial similarity in 7 of 9 design elements. It found that the modifications between the original and the derivative product were consistent with the pattern of modifications made to avoid exact duplication while retaining functional and aesthetic derivation. It found that an independent designer starting from scratch would be unlikely to arrive at the same combination of features by coincidence. It used the word unlikely 3 times and the word improbable once. Cobb's attorneys had looked at this report and had come back with a settlement offer. Earl stood at the bench with the phone at his ear and the shop going quiet around him. Gary and Dennis and Bernadette all working, but all tuned to the frequency of his stillness. "How much?" he said. Sandra told him. The number was $340,000. Earl was quiet for a moment. He was running arithmetic. 340,000 was not far from what he had calculated as the revenue Cobb's operation had generated from the infringing products during the period of infringement. It was not everything. It was not punitive. It was what a man paid when he had been caught and had decided that the cost of continued fight exceeded the cost of settlement, which was the decision of a man who was calculating rather than accepting responsibility. But the number was real, and the number was substantial, and the number would do what Earl needed a large number to do right now. "Will it hold up," he said, "if he signs?" "It's binding," Sandra said. "Full release of claims on the infringement, injunction on the tri-state line, payment within 90 days. Earl looked at the shelf where his father's notebook sat. He looked at the folder beside it. He thought about Cobb standing in this barn in May with his hands in his jacket pockets and his careful, warm voice saying Ray would have been proud. "Tell him yes," Earl said. He hung up and set the phone down on the bench. The shop was very quiet. Then Gary said from his station without looking up, "Good news or bad news?" "Good," Earl said. Gary nodded once and went back to his stitching. Dennis did the same. Bernadette said nothing. She was running the edge finisher along a belt, and the sound of it was steady and clean in the barn. The sound of work continuing because work does not pause for outcomes. It simply continues, which is one of the things about it that Earl had always found trustworthy. He picked up his swivel knife and went back to the leather. He told Vera that evening. She was sitting at the kitchen table with her end-of-year grading, the stacks of folders that accumulated every June with the specific weight of 30 children's work over 9 months. She listened, and when he finished, she set down her pen. "340, she said. "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. She did the same arithmetic Earl had done. He could see her doing it, the particular stillness of a woman running numbers in her head. "That's the barn paid," she said. "That's materials covered for 2 years at current volume. That's Jesse's setup paid back." She paused. "That's the next thing." "Yes," Earl said. She picked up her pen. She looked at him with the look that was not soft, the look that was clear. "Your father would have gone to court," she said. "I know," Earl said. "I'm not my father." She looked at him for another moment, and something in her expression shifted, very slightly, into something that was not disagreement. "No," she said. "You're not." She said it in a way that meant both things at once, the way she often meant both things at once, which was one of the reasons 30 years with her had never felt like enough. The settlement was signed in September. Cobb Hargrove's name did not appear in any public document connected to it. The NDA that was part of the agreement was Cobb's condition, and Earl's attorney had allowed it because the money was real and the injunction was real, and the identity of the person who had wronged Earl Denton was known to everyone in Muskingum County who needed to know it, which is how these things work in small counties, which is through the specific and efficient social network of people who pay attention. Dale Marsh found out on a Thursday and called to say 3 words, "About damn time." Then he hung up. Earl smiled at the phone after Dale hung up. It was not a large smile. It was the kind of smile that a man allows himself when something that was wrong has been made at least partially right, not celebrating, just acknowledging. He deposited the check when it arrived in November. He sat in the parking lot of the bank for a while after coming out. Then he drove to the barn and worked for the rest of the afternoon. Vera got sick in the spring of the following year. It did not announce itself dramatically. It came the way most serious things come in real life, which is not as a single event but as a sequence of small signals that accumulate meaning slowly and then suddenly all at once. A tiredness that did not respond to sleep, a cough that had been present for too long, a visit to Dr. Harmon that led to a referral that led to a scan that led to an afternoon in a consultation room in Columbus, with a doctor named Chen who had the specific quality of attention that distinguishes the doctors who are honest about difficult things from the ones who dress difficult things in comfortable language. The diagnosis was clear. The prognosis was what it was. Vera listened to Dr. Chen the way she listened to everything that mattered, without interrupting, with her hands folded in her lap and her attention complete. Earl sat beside her, and his hand found hers on the armrest between the chairs without him deciding to reach for it. They drove home mostly without speaking, and when they got home, they sat together at the kitchen table for a long time, and the particular silence between them in that hour was the most complete silence Earl had ever been inside of, the kind that contains everything. She taught the following school year. She did not stop. She had 30 children in a third-grade classroom who needed what she had always given them, which was the specific quality of attention that made a child feel seen, and she was not going to fail to give them that because of what was happening inside her body. Earl did not argue with this. He had been married to Vera for long enough to understand the shape of her resolve, and to understand that her resolve in this case was not denial. It was the same thing that had made her file the copyright registration before anyone knew it was needed. She understood what was important, and she organized herself around it. He worked in the barn every morning and was home by 3 every afternoon. He drove her to Columbus for treatment on Tuesdays. He cooked dinner every night, badly at first and then with improving competence, learning the kitchen the way he had learned the barn, through repetition and attention and the willingness to be wrong and correct. Jesse called every day. He drove home from Columbus every other weekend, not asked, simply present. There was a Sunday in November when the 3 of them sat at the kitchen table after dinner, the table cleared, the dishes done, the evening outside going dark the way November evenings go dark in Ohio, completely and without delay. Vera had her hands around a mug of tea. Jesse was looking at something on his phone and then put it face down on the table the way he did when he had decided to be fully present rather than partially. Earl was looking at the salt shaker, which was shaped like a barn, which Vera had bought at a craft fair 20 years ago and which had lived on this table ever since. Vera said, "I want to tell you something about the business." Both of them looked at her. "When Earl started," she said, "I thought it might last a year. I thought it was good for him, good for those months, good for the grief of the plant." She looked at her tea. "But it became something real. It became something that has his father in it and something that has him in it and something that will have Jesse in it. She looked up at them both. I want you to know that I know that. I wanted to say it while I could say it clearly. The kitchen was very quiet. Jessie said, "Mom." She put her hand up, not dismissively, just the gesture of a woman who has chosen her moment and does not want it changed. She looked at Earl. Earl looked back at her, and his face did not do anything complicated because it did not need to. They were past the point where the face needed to work hard. The face was just the face of a man looking at the person who mattered most to him in a world that was in the process of taking her away, and there was nothing to be done about that except look. "Your father's belt," she said to Jesse. "Your grandfather's design. That is what I want on the table when I am not here. That continuity." She picked up her tea. "That is what I am proud of." Jesse looked at the table. His jaw moved once and held. Earl said nothing. There was nothing adequate to say, so he did not attempt inadequacy. He reached across and put his hand over hers around the mug, the same gesture he had made in Dr. Chen's office, the wordless language of 30 years, and she turned her hand over underneath his and held it. They sat like that for a while. The barn was dark outside. The November night pressed against the windows. The salt shaker, shaped like a barn, sat in the middle of the table where it had sat for 20 years and would sit for 20 more. Vera died in April. She had taught through February. She had been home in March, which was quiet, which was for the family. April came and she was there on a Saturday morning, and on Sunday morning she was not. Earl did not break. That is not to say he was unmoved, which would be a lie and an insult to both of them. He was moved as deeply as a man can be moved by a loss this fundamental. He simply did not break. He understood this about himself in the days after, sitting in the same kitchen, looking at the same yard, drinking coffee from the same mug at the same window where she had stood so many mornings watching the yard with the things she was not ready to say out loud. He had been built for a great many things and not for this, but he was built solidly enough that even this, the thing he was not built for, did not bring the structure down. He did not go to the barn for 2 weeks. Gary and Dennis and Bernadette ran it. Jesse was home. Jesse managed the correspondence and the orders and the production schedule, and he did it without being asked, and without making it a point, and without ever suggesting that he was carrying anything that Earl should feel bad about not carrying. On the 15th day, Earl woke at 5:47 in the morning, the old time, the plant time, the time his body had never entirely released. He lay in the dark for a moment. Then he got up and dressed and made coffee and stood at the kitchen window and looked at the yard in the early gray light. The barn. The 3 acres of dead spring grass going green at the edges. The corner of the yard where the pile of leather scraps had sat in the November of 5 years ago. He took his coffee outside. He walked to the barn in the morning cold. He unlocked it and turned on the lights and stood in the doorway and looked at the 4 workstations and the tool organization and the belts on the drying rack and his father's notebook on the shelf above the primary bench. He walked to the bench and set down his coffee and picked up the notebook. He opened it. He had read these pages many times now. He knew every diagram and every note and every margin annotation. But he opened it this morning the way you open something that has never stopped being important, with the same attention you gave it the first time. At the bottom of the final design page, his father's handwriting in the slightly different hand of a later edition. "I never got around to this. Life came in and I put it down, but someone should make this. It is a good idea, it would hold up." Earl read it and set the notebook back on the shelf. He put on his apron. He picked up the swivel knife. He worked. Jesse found him there 2 hours later. The boy stood in the doorway with 2 mugs of coffee, the same posture Earl had first seen him use in March 2 years ago, the coffee slightly away from the body, the stillness of someone taking in a scene before deciding whether to enter it. He crossed the barn and set a mug beside Earl's tools without a word. He pulled a stool up to the adjacent bench and sat down. They worked alongside each other in silence for an hour. Jesse was not fast yet, and his cuts were still working toward the consistency that came with months of doing. But he was serious about it in the way Earl had always been serious about it, which was the way of a man who understands that the work itself is the point, and that seriousness is not the same as heaviness, but is simply the quality of full attention brought to a real task. Jesse stopped cutting. He set the swivel knife down and reached into the breast pocket of his flannel shirt and produced a folded piece of paper that had the color and texture of something old, something that had been handled and refolded many times. He set it on the workbench between them. Earl looked at it. He did not pick it up. "I found it 2 weeks ago," Jesse said. "Going through Mom's filing cabinet in the back of the bottom drawer, there was a box of Grandpa Ray's things she kept, old photographs, his discharge papers, a small envelope." Jesse looked at the paper. It was sealed. Your name was on the front in his handwriting. Earl looked at the paper for a long moment. The barn was very quiet around them. Outside, a truck moved down Drummond Road, and the sound of it rose and fell and was gone. He picked up the paper. He unfolded it. It was a single sheet in Ray Denton's compressed, careful hand, the same hand from the notebook, the same hand he had been reading for 5 years. The writing was not dated. It had the quality of something written in a single sitting and never revised. He read it. It said, "Earl, I have been meaning to say this for a long time and keep finding reasons not to. You are a better man than I was at your age. You work hard and you are honest and you love your family the right way, which is the quiet way, the way that is still there when the loud ways are gone. I have been watching you for a long time and I want you to know that. The belt is in the notebook. I never built it. I put it down because I told myself there was no time, and after a while the no time became the truth. Do not be me. If there is something in you that wants to build something, build it, even if nobody wants it at first, even if it takes longer than seems fair. Build it so your hands know they made something real. A man needs that. Not the money from it and not the recognition from it. The knowledge that his hands made something that holds. I should have told you this earlier. I am telling you now, your father, Ray." Earl set the letter down on the workbench. He set it down carefully, the way he set down things that deserved careful handling. He sat with it for a long time. Jesse did not say anything. He understood, in the way that children who have paid attention eventually understand their parents, that there was nothing to say, that the room needed to hold this without anyone adding to it. After a while, Earl folded the letter along its original creases and held it in both hands. He thought about his father sitting down to write this and deciding not to send it. He thought about Ray Denton putting it in an envelope and writing Earl's name on the front, and then putting it in a box in a drawer and letting it wait there for the right time, which the right time had never come to during Ray's lifetime and had been found, finally, by the next generation. The way these things often are, at exactly the moment when they were most needed. He placed the letter on the shelf beside the notebook, the two things that Ray had left him, the design that taught his hands, the words that had been waiting for the hands to be ready to receive them. He looked at Jesse. Jesse looked at him. Neither of them said anything for another moment. Then Earl picked up the swivel knife and went back to the leather. At some point, Jesse said, without looking up from what he was cutting, "I talked to a guy in Denver, outfitter. He wants to carry us." Earl kept his eyes on his own cut. What kind of operation? Small, high-end. Sells to mountaineers and working ranch people. He sent a breakdown. His customers are our customers. Earl finished the pass. He set the knife down and looked at the belt taking shape on the bench. "What did you tell him?" "Told him I needed to talk to you." Earl picked up the knife and set it to the next line. "Tell him yes." Jesse went back to his cutting. The barn settled into the rhythm of two people working, the sound of the swivel knife and the stitching awl and the edge finisher, the sound of leather being made into something by hands that understood what they were doing. Not silence exactly. The sound that work makes when it is going the way it is supposed to go. At mid-morning, Earl stopped and went to the shelf. He took down the folder that had sat next to the notebook for 2 years now, the folder that had held the copyright documents and the tri-state work gear evidence and the settlement paperwork, all of that resolved and finished. He looked at the folder for a moment. Then he took it down and put it in the filing cabinet under the bench. It belonged there now. The past belonged in the cabinet. The shelf was for what was current. He set the notebook back in the center of the shelf, where it had always been. He looked at Jesse from across the barn. Jesse was bent over his work, the same forward lean that Earl used, the same angle of the head that put the good eye directly over the line, the posture of a craftsman who has started to understand the relationship between where you look and where the cut goes. Earl had thought about legacy most of his adult life without using that word because that word belonged to the kind of men who thought about themselves in large terms, and he was not that kind of man. He had thought about it in the language he actually used, which was, "What are you leaving behind?" Not money, not property, not a name in a foundation. What is the thing that has your hands in it that will keep going? Ray Denton had left a notebook. He had left tools. He had left a design that was so careful and so specific and so thoroughly thought through that 40 years of sitting in a box had not diminished it, had not made it dated, had not made it less true. Ray had put something real into the world, and then life had come in and he had put it down, and the thing had waited, patient as leather is patient, for the right moment and the right hands. Earl had built the thing. He had built it in a cold garage in the worst 4 months of his adult life, with his father's tools and his father's notebook, and 300 pounds of leather scraps that a dishonest man had left in his corner of the yard, without understanding what he was providing the material for. He had built it into something that employed 4 people and served men he would never meet in places he had never been, men who put things on their bodies and needed those things to hold. And now Jesse was here, not because Earl had asked, not because the business needed him, though it did, because the boy had picked up a belt one Saturday morning in a barn in Ohio, and his hands had told him what his assumptions had not prepared him for, which was that this was real, that this was the thing, that this was what it felt like when something had been made correctly by someone who understood why correctly mattered. The belt that started all of it was still in this barn. The first one, the one Earl had made in the garage in November 5 years ago, the one with the 2 millimeter deviation on the left side of the buckle plate that only Earl could see. He had hung it on a nail above the shelf where the notebook lived. It was not for sale. It was not a display. It was simply there, the way a first thing is simply there, the proof of a beginning, the evidence that at some point there was a man in a cold garage with a set of inherited tools, and a pile of discarded leather, and a notebook full of a dead man's unfinished work. And the man had looked at all of it and decided to begin. That belt had been worn hard and returned to the nail. It had darkened the way good leather darkens with use, deeply and evenly, the color of old wood. The stitching was intact. The brass hardware had the full patina of a working life. It would last another 20 years without question. It would hold up. That was what his father had written. 40 years before Earl found the notebook, before any of this existed, before Earl had any reason to believe that his worst year would become the foundation of something real, Ray Denton had written those 4 words at the bottom of a design page in a composition notebook. It is a good idea. It would hold up. Earl Denton looked at the belt on the nail above the shelf. He looked at his son across the barn, bent over the bench, the swivel knife making its careful pass along the line. He looked at the morning light coming through the high small window and lying across the workbench in a long pale rectangle the same way it had come through the garage window in November 5 years ago. He thought about Vera at the kitchen table. He thought about her handing him the laptop with the Forum Post and waiting for him to catch up to what she already knew. He thought about her sitting across from Sandra Birch in Columbus and pulling a savings account statement out of her purse and saying, "I want to file a copyright for my husband's work," and the attorney saying, "Does your husband know you are doing this?" and Vera saying, "Not yet." He thought about her at the kitchen table in November with her hands around a mug of tea, saying, "This is what I am proud of." He thought about his father in the winter of 1967 at a kitchen table in a house that no longer stood, working through a problem in a composition notebook, getting it right, putting it down because life came in, putting it in a box, not throwing it away because he understood it was worth keeping even if he could not use it himself. 3 generations of this. The man who had the idea and could not build it. The man who built what the first man imagined. The man who will take it forward into the world the first 2 men could not reach. This was not a business story. It had never been a business story, though it had a business in it. It was a story about what a man leaves when he makes something real, and how that real thing moves through time in the hands of the people who come after him, changing and continuing, losing something and gaining something. The thread of it unbroken because the thread was made well to begin with, and because the people carrying it understood what they were carrying and why it mattered. Earl picked up the swivel knife. He set it to the leather. He made the cut clean and straight and correct, the blade following the grain the way it had learned to follow it over 5 years and hundreds of belts, and every lesson the work had taught him since the first night in the garage when he ruined 4 pieces and kept going. Jesse looked up from his bench. He did not say anything. He watched his father work for a moment with the specific attention of someone who is memorizing something, not because they are trying to, but because the thing in front of them is worth the effort of memory. Then Jesse looked back down at his own work and made his own cut. Outside the barn, the Ohio morning was doing what Ohio mornings do in the good months, which is to arrive without drama and take up all the available space with light and the smell of the ground waking up and the particular quality of a rural quiet that is not empty but full of the specific sounds of things growing and things working, and the occasional truck on Drummond Road carrying someone somewhere for reasons that belong to that person and no one else. The barn was warm from the work. The belts on the drying rack were ready to be conditioned. The waiting list on Jesse's laptop had 68 names on it. Gary would arrive at 8, Bernadette at 8:15. Dennis had called the day before to say he was bringing a new tool he had found at an estate sale, a vintage edge creaser that he thought Earl should look at, and he was probably right. Everything that needed to happen was happening. Everything that was lost and carried and not set down, not because it was too heavy to set down, but because it was worth the carrying. Everything that was made remained made and would remain so. Earl Denton worked in the morning light of a barn in Muskingum County, Ohio, and the leather took shape under his hands the way it always took shape, one cut at a time, one stitch at a time, the way anything real is built, which is slowly and with full attention, and with the understanding that the thing you are making will outlast the morning, will outlast the season, will outlast you if you make it well enough, and the making well enough is the whole of the work, the whole of the point. The whole of what it means to be a man who builds something and means it to hold. It held. The Denver outfitter called in June. His name was Marcus Webb, and he had been running a small specialty outdoor gear shop for 18 years. the kind of operation that survived on reputation rather than volume, that sold things that were actually what they claimed to be. He had gotten Earl's contact through Welding Web, the same forum that had started everything 3 years before, through the chain that word about real things travels, person to person, because the thing worked and working things get talked about. Webb had a question before placing a wholesale order. He asked Earl to describe not the specs, not the materials, but what he was trying to make and why. Earl was quiet for a moment. No one had asked him why before. He thought about Ray in Steubenville in 1967, noticing a problem no one was solving. He thought about a winter kitchen table, a composition notebook, careful handwriting, a box on a shelf, a garage in November. He said, "I am trying to make something a working man can trust with his body all day in conditions that will destroy anything made carelessly. The way my father understood it needed to be made before he had the chance to make it himself." There was a pause. "How many can you get me by September?" Webb said. 24. "I'll take them, same in December." Earl wrote it on the order pad. 24 belts to Denver, from a barn on Drummond Road in Muskingum County, Ohio, built by people the industry had decided it no longer needed. He filed the order and went back to the bench. By the end of that year, the barn was running at capacity. Gary and Dennis were both full-time with benefits that Earl had introduced in the spring, modest but real, health insurance, and 2 weeks paid time off. The things that Ashland Steel had given Earl for 22 years, and that he understood from the inside were not perks, but the basic conditions under which a man could give his full attention to his work, without the low hum of financial anxiety, undermining the quality of everything he produced. He had known this at Ashland and forgotten it, and remembered it again now that he was the one responsible for providing it. Jesse had taken a leave of absence from his Columbus job in August and had not gone back. He managed the business side with the same quality of attention that Earl brought to the bench, systematic and unglamorous and thorough, the kind of management that makes itself invisible because, when it is done correctly, the problems it prevents never appear. He was on the phone twice a week with a shop in Portland and another in Bozeman, and he had brought in a third wholesale account in Nashville through a connection he had made online with a man who outfitted construction crews across the Mid-South. They did not talk about this much over dinner. They did not talk about the business much at all in the kitchen, because the kitchen was not the barn, and the barn was for the work, and the kitchen was for the rest of it, the part that was not the work but was what made the work worth doing. They ate dinner most nights at the same table where Vera had sat for 30 years, and the salt shaker barn was still in the middle where it always was, and they talked about other things, about the county and the people in it, and the weather and what Dennis's daughter had done that was funny, and whether the north field was worth turning over for a garden in the spring. Vera's absence was in all of it, not as a wound any longer, or not only as a wound, as a presence of a specific kind, the way a person who shaped a place continues to shape it through what they arranged, and what they chose, and what they made possible by being there for the years they were there. The kitchen had Vera in it, the way an old house has the people who lived in it well, not as ghosts, but as a quality of the light, and the particular way things are arranged that you did not arrange, and that you would not rearrange because the arrangement was right. Earl did not talk about this. He was not built for talking about it. He lived in it every day and understood it every day, and that was enough. In the second autumn after Vera died, Jesse brought a woman to dinner. Her name was Claire, and she taught at a school in Columbus, and she had the kind of steadiness about her that Earl recognized as the same quality Vera had had. Jesse was careful about bringing her, which told Earl everything he needed to know about how serious it was. After dinner, she asked to see the barn. Earl took her out and turned on the lights, and she stood in the doorway the way everyone stood in the doorway, taking in the organized intentionality of it. She went to the shelf and looked at the belt on the nail above the notebook. The first one. "Is this the first one?" she said. "Yes." She looked at it for a moment. "How long will it last?" Earl looked at it too. The darkened leather, the intact stitching, the brass with its working patina. "Longer than me," he said. She nodded once. She looked at the notebook and then at Earl. "He was lucky," she said, "your father, that you found it." Earl looked at the notebook beside the letter on the shelf. He thought about November 5 years ago, the storage room, the orange light, the metal case behind the Farm Bureau magazines. He thought about sitting at the kitchen table with the notebook in both hands without opening it. "I was the lucky one," he said. He turned off the light and they went back inside. The barn ran through that winter and into the following spring. Gary's stitching had reached a consistency that Earl could not improve upon and told him so, which Gary received with the specific embarrassed pleasure of a man who has been told by the right person that his work is genuinely good. Dennis had fully committed to hardware fitting and had developed a technique for setting the brass buckle assembly that was faster than Earl's own and produced a cleaner seat, and Earl had adopted it, which was the kind of thing that only happens in an operation where the people in it are secure enough to improve on the man who taught them. Bernadette had begun training a fifth person, a young man from the next county who had shown up one Tuesday in March having read about the company in a regional magazine piece that Jesse had arranged without telling Earl, and that had run under a headline Earl had not seen before it was published. The headline said, "The last belt you will ever buy." Earl had read it once and put the magazine on the shelf in the barn and not said anything about it, which Jesse correctly interpreted as approval. The fifth person's name was Owen, 22 years old, no background in leatherworking, who had driven to Drummond Road from Caldwell on a Tuesday in March after reading the magazine piece, knocked on the door, and said he wanted to know if there was work. Earl had looked at his hands on the doorstep. Broad, hard-knuckled, the hands of someone who had been doing physical work since he was old enough to be put to use. "You know anything about leather?" Earl said. "No," Owen said. "Willing to learn it the right way?" "Yes, sir." Earl hired him. Bernadette began his training that afternoon. By month's end, Owen was coming in early on his own to practice on scrap, which told Earl everything he needed to know. Earl watched all of this from his bench and understood that the thing his father had designed in the winter of 1967 and never built was now being built by 6 people in a barn in Ohio that had started as a hay storage facility and had become, without any particular announcement of the transformation, something else entirely. A place where people came and learned and worked and left each day having made something that would outlast the day. A place where the quality of the work was the standard, and the standard was set by a dead man's notebook and maintained by the living. This was not what Earl had intended when he carried an armload of leather scraps into the garage in November of the year they laid him off. He had not intended anything that large. He had intended to make something with his hands because his hands needed a reason, and the garage was cold, and the morning was empty, and there was a notebook on the shelf that contained something worth building. But a thing that is built correctly tends to grow, not because of ambition, though ambition can be part of it, because real things attract people who are looking for real things, and the world is full of people looking for real things and finding, more often than not, things that look real and are not. When something genuine appears, those people recognize it. Their hands know, and they tell the person next to them who needs to know. That was how this had grown, Not through strategy, though Jesse's strategy had been sound. Not through marketing, though the website and the wholesale accounts and the regional magazine piece had all contributed. Through the specific and ancient and irreplaceable mechanism of one man telling another man, I found a thing that works. Here is where it comes from. Here is what it cost. Here is what it is made of. Go look for yourself. Earl made that thing. Ray had imagined it. Earl had built it. Jesse was carrying it forward. Owen was learning to add his hands to it. Gary and Dennis and Bernadette were the people who showed up every day and did the work that made all of it possible, the work that nobody outside the barn would ever see specifically, but that was in every finished belt that left the barn and went out into the world to be tested by the bodies of men who needed things to hold. It held. The morning light came through the high small window of the barn and fell across the workbench where it had always fallen, in a long pale rectangle that moved across the leather as the morning moved, tracking time in the oldest way, by light and shadow on a surface where work was being done. Earl set the swivel knife to the leather, he made the cut, he moved to the next one. Everything that needed to be made was being made. Everything that mattered had been, in the end, and against significant opposition and at considerable personal cost, and with more time passing than seemed fair, and with the help of people who had loved him well and deserved to be loved in return, made to hold.